is from.
Welcome to beautiful Half Moon Bay. We are calling our City of Half Moon Bay Planning Commission for Tuesday, August 29th into session. Can I get a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner DeMann,
Here.
Commissioner Benjamin,
Here.
Commissioner Evans,
Here.
Vice Chair Holt,
Here.
and Chair Hernandez.
Present.
All are present.
Excellent. Next item on the agenda is the approval of minutes from the August 8th meeting. Do you have any comments or questions about the minutes?
I move we approve the minutes dated August 8th, 2017.
Second.
Can I get a vote? Aye.
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 Very good.
Okay.
Next item. We have a public hearing item, a study session on the local coastal land use plan, coastal hazards, scenic and visual resources, and cultural resources. Before we get to that, I don't have any green cards for public comment.
Oh, that's okay.
If you have an item that's not on the agenda,
Probably not.
perfect. Please.
Good.
Now
Go
is
for
your
it.
time. Please make sure the green light is on,
Just push the front button.
and
State your name.
if you would please state your name.
My name's Gabriel Torres. I recognize you from some of the other meetings we had last year. Just who I am, I'm a captain for a whale watching company down in Monterey Bay. I'm a property owner here in Half Moon Bay. I bought a piece of land on Redondo Beach Road in 2002 with the money I probably should have gone to college with, but anyways. Back then, I asked permission from the planning commission or the planning office to plant a row of trees, of native trees on my property, which is now just still grass with the odd bush. And I was declined. They stated that it is considered development to plant trees. And I just wanted to know if that's still the case. It's my piece of property. I'd like to beautify it in hopes of a future for it. And can you help me?
I appreciate your comments. This is not an agenda item, so I can't comment on it during the meeting. I'll direct city staff to respond.
We're happy to work with Gabe at City Hall. Can you give me a call sometime?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
good.
I just don't
Yeah.
know when to.
Yep, yeah.
Okay.
Anytime, yeah. Okay.
And
thanks.
then they have to give their opinion on it after. Is that it?
They, let's talk about it at City Hall. We'll talk
Okay.
about the process.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see one other quasi-member of the public. For the record, the mayor is here. Do we have any other comments? If not, I'm going to close public session, public forum. Okay, let's move on to the public hearing. Jill.
Thank you. And before I begin, I believe that our interim community development director, Hanson Hom, has been able to introduce himself to most of you. I just want to acknowledge that Hanson is here tonight, and we're really pleased to have him at City Hall supporting our shop. So, and welcome. All right. So, we continue on with the local coastal land use plan. Tonight, we are going to provide an overview of the 3 new working draft chapters that you've received over the last week or so. Cultural resources, coastal hazards, and scenic and visual resources. For each chapter, we'll take this order, acknowledging the Coastal Act context applicable to the content, some highlights of the General Plan Advisory Committee and community input, what the approach was in updating the chapter, And then, of course, encouraging your discussion as well as taking public input on this. Sort of the two pieces of discussion that we're really hoping to hear from the staff side, because it helps us move forward, is it going in the right direction? And is it complete? What is it missing? And of course, anything else you can add to that, do so. We're happy to hear it. So with that, let's jump right in. And I have a question. Is we can do these one at a time and have a discussion, or I can go ahead and present all of it.
Why don't you go ahead and get started, and we'll see.
Let's
if
see
we
how
have
it
any
goes.
questions as we go.
Fair enough. All right. Let us begin with cultural resources. So the Coastal Act policy for cultural resources, there's really one, and it's focused on archaeological and paleontological resources. And it's the 1993 LUP is very short on this category. It only has 5 policies. They all apply to ARC. We don't have known paleo resources. That said, the Coastal Commission guidance document says it is okay to do quite a bit more. And in terms of what would be more, we're thinking about historic resources in particular. And it's not to say that the 93 LUP doesn't acknowledge historic resources. It does in a number of other places, including in the scenic and the visual resources chapter. So it's not an ignored topic, but it's not as developed as perhaps it could be. One example that the guidance document gives is Carmel, and I have their beautiful document with me. It is really detailed. I think it's more than we need. So we looked at it for inspiration and then dialed it back a little bit. So with respect to the General Plan Advisory Committee and community input on this topic area from the 2016 draft, we heard mostly about historic resource protection, in particular downtown, in terms of individual structures and maybe even thinking about a district, as well as the historic buildings that remain and are associated with our agricultural uses. So the approach in your revised draft, this August working draft, was to strengthen the archaeological protections, in particular looking at having improved archiving, inventory, noting that this isn't at a high level of detail, cannot be public information. These sites are really sensitive, and those records need to be carefully protected. But there are ways to do that, and it would improve the city's ability to provide advice and understand when there's a site that may be subject to one of these resources, because there are some that are mapped in town. And then the other side of it, and you'll see quite a bit more new content on this, was to provide a scope that I think is more akin to what you'd have in a historic resources element in a general plan. General plans are allowed to have these elements. It would be considered an optional element, or sometimes it's worked into land use. But to provide a little bit more of that kind of attention to the resources. Half Moon Bay has amazing historic resources, as you know, and staff feels quite passionate about this, actually. So that came into some of this work. Furthermore, on the approach, so you'll see policies regarding historic resources with respect to training, in particular for us as a team, the Planning Commission and city staff. There's great ways to get a lot more information and appreciation for the Secretary of Interior Standards, for example, for the process of resource designation, for reviewing districts and things like that. So this is not the short-term super hot item that we might want to deal with when the plan is adopted, but it's something that we would like to start working on in the next wave. Another policy that we think is really important is updating the Historic Resources Ordinance, and I think the policy refers to it that way. To be more specific, that is part of the zoning code or the implementation plan. It's 18.39 in the municipal code. It only has 3 sections in it, and I gotta be honest with you, one section leads to the next, and by the time you get to the 3rd section, you're demolishing the resource. Staff is uncomfortable with that. So we would imagine coming back with you when we're working on zoning and having quite a bit more to chew on for that part of our code. We also recognize that CEQA, historic preservation, is a key CEQA category, and being in compliance with that through both your policy as well as the city zoning is something that we're paying attention to as well. So that's why it looks like it does. So now it's 11 pages and it has 21 policies, so it's a little bit beefier. We wanted to note a couple things. One, there's in the discussion of what's missing, of course, we're more interested in what you think is missing, but I missed something that was on my list, and I didn't get it in there. It's the Mills Act contracts. Property tax relief program, and it's basically a contract with a property owner who receives property tax relief in exchange for their really involved restoration of a historic resource. It's not a gift of public funds. It's acknowledging that the historic resource is part of the public benefit. Some of these contracts can be for a work program for 5 or 10 years. Actually, Scott Phillips, back at our current planner, has had a lot of background in setting up Mills Act contract programs. I've reviewed the agreements. I've never set one up. They have to be approved by the State Historic Preservation Officer, otherwise we refer to as SHPO. But that's something that in your next version we will add that policy, assuming that you're comfortable with that. And then the other little note that we wanted to make is there's a map in this chapter with the resources that the consultants had identified back in the existing conditions report. And we know it's missing quite a few that are actually on our books. It's actually missing quite a few that we drive around and see that we have no documentation on. And so my suggestion would be, you don't need to have this map in the LUP. I think it would be really wise to have implementation of the policy for establishing a very good inventory that's kept up to date and added to as resources are discovered, but not needing to end up with an LUP that has a stale map. We would much rather have the living document be the historic resources inventory. You can go another way with it, but that would be a practice that I would personally be comfortable with, and just put that out there for you. My concern about putting a map like this in here is staff may, or somebody, a developer, a community member may refer to that map and believe that that is the map. We would put notes on it and all that kind of thing if you want to keep it in the book, but that's just the thinking there. So that's the whole of the cultural resources overview that I was going to give, so I can move to coastal hazards, or we can stop and talk.
You guys want to keep going?
So my thought was maybe we could just cover this quickly. I don't know how many other items there are. Maybe people have a lot of comments on this. Mine were quite brief. Happy to go on if that would be
I
appropriate.
think it's fine to go ahead and cover this while we're all here. So I'm going to open it up for discussion. on this particular topic. Do you have any questions for staff on this item? Did you want to have a discussion?
Short but sweet.
Okay, so I'm gonna open up public comment around cultural resources. Seeing no public comment on cultural resources, if you do have comments around that section, you can get up and speak now and provide a green card later. Otherwise, I'm gonna move to have a discussion amongst us about this. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I thought this was an excellent document. Thank you, staff, for writing what I thought was really fine. My comments are actually part of the staff report, so I won't repeat them here. I think there were only 4 or 5, and you know me. That means I was really happy with the document when there's so few. I think that the Mills Act is an excellent addition. I support that change. I also think that the comment about having a living map actually is a more general issue in our planning processes than cultural resources. We're going to discover new hazards, new issues, our PUDs, our zoning. All of our maps are going to be changing over time. And if we're including something that people think, if we're including it so that people have a sort of a representative notion of how we thought about it as a snapshot, as a document of the way we were thinking at the time that we drafted it, then it's okay to have a map. But I do think that a living document that is a GIS layer of a living infrastructure model of the city is vital, and this is just one layer of it. No other comments. Thank you.
Ryan, do you have any comments?
I have no comments.
John?
Thank you, Jill. This is really, for this section, it's really good. I agree with everything you've brought up in this section. There's more detail that'll come up in the visual resources. But might as well bring them up now. I have sort of 2 just sort of general questions. Is the only definition we have for historic this one that I've seen in this document that's older than 50 years? Do we have some other definition somewhere else? Or is that the only definition we have?
I think that's the only definition we have in this document, and I can spend some time looking up other choices. There are some very specific requirements about National Register and state resource acknowledgements, and so that's why those 2 are included in here, because those are the designations that provide the most protection. So I'd be interested in what else you're thinking about.
Well, for now, it's just, that's the only definition I see is
Okay.
here.
Yep.
And then the other question I had that is that is there a connection between resources and policies? How does that, in these documents, how does that work?
So for this one, and I have to beg off for a second because I just finished living in scenic and visual resources, and I can answer that question really well right now for that one. For this one, we are trying to establish the existing condition and a range of what is present in the community, and then relate it to what would need protection, or potentially some kind of other support, preservation. For example, adaptive reuse is a policy that is in here that encourages retention of a historic structure, even if the originally intended use is no longer viable, to try to make changes to it. So what I'm getting from your question, though, is you're not seeing a connection, and I'm more interested in...
Just trying to understand there.
Yeah.
And it comes up more specifically for me in the visual resources.
Okay.
But
Okay.
so one is identifying kind of what's here, and the other is policy that's not necessarily directly connected.
Right, but also the framework for policy is, in this particular section, is set by the Coastal Act policy, as well as, because we're going past the Coastal Act here, as well as for the federal and state context for resources, including CEQA, and then, of course, the Native American tribes requirements. So that whole first section before that historic context discussion is really pointing to the kinds of policy that needs to be incorporated.
Thank you.
If I could, though, just to address John's comments, when I look at cultural resources specifically, starting on page 9, we have a land use plan framework and general policies specified. So I think that there are some pretty clear policies that are called out, including the very first policy, which is protect and preserve Half Moon Bay's archaeological, paleontological, and historic resources. I might like to see a shall in there, but other than that, I mean, I think that the policies, that's the only comment I have on the policies, but they are pretty extensive in this section. Les, did you have a?
Yeah, just from a contextual standpoint, more policy-oriented. I know in the past we've had the opportunity as planners to name something historical or cultural. For example, the train out there, the caboose, a few years ago. So what I'm trying to put into context is, if our view of downtown Half Moon Bay is an opportunity to both live, work, and play, there may very well be constraints in terms of what we say might be a historical resource, and then doing the other. So just from a policy standpoint, I mean, I don't want to write the code at this point, but I just want to make sure that there is not a black and white condition that says it's over 50 years old, it's a historical resource. That I think there needs to be some context from an opportunity standpoint, so that we can approve our downtown land use policy and not be constrained by other historic resources and other resources.
May I respond to that just briefly? Very good point. Just because it's over 50 years old does not render it a resource. It means we do need to look into it. Many structures over 50 years old won't qualify. They've been modified in such a way that they no longer bear the architectural qualities, or they are not associated with a particular time period or event or person, and so they are perhaps fabric buildings of your town that you appreciate and can modify and change over time, but are not limited by a historic designation. And that's evaluated by architectural historians. They really have a process, and you'll see their work. Actually, we have something coming your way at one of your next meetings, and it will have what we call a DPR form, Department of Parks. It's out of the State Parks Department, and it's their tool for evaluating resources.
That address your question, Les? Great, thank you. I appreciate not putting a list of resources in the LUP. My concern with the living documents we've inherited over the years is that when we punt on certain things, like designations of planned unit developments, that's a sticky issue we often run across. There's no follow-up or enforcement mechanism. So maybe we add, my suggestion would be we add a policy that says on an annual basis, staff will bring a list of historic sites to the Planning Commission for review. And so we have some kind of process in place where we're at least looking at them, we see it, even if it's pro forma, just because 20 years later, some of the things called out, 30 years later, some of the things called out in the current LCP haven't been executed. And so I'd just like to see some kind of policy that says we need to do this annually, or have it reviewed annually. That's my suggestion. I don't know if other commissioners share that or.
So, through the chair, I don't, for historic, that makes sense. For cultural, we can't do it. For Isha's, we have gone 25 years without updating our maps, and I do think it's problematic. I'm not sure if a year's, I'm not disagreeing about the idea of doing it periodically. I don't know what the right frequency is.
I think it's a fair question for a lot of these items, but that's something where if staff can come back to us with a recommendation on what they think a reasonable time period is, I think that would be helpful. Thank you. And certainly within a certain period of once we create this document, at least the first time around, it'd be good to try to at least nail down what we think the historical and cultural sites are. Thanks. Okay, I have no other comments on this section, not seeing anything else. We'll close this item and we will move on. Which one's next on your list, Jill? All right. By the way, I just want to call out the great irony of having a building that has been demolished. We should keep it. It's a great example.
I couldn't help myself. It was significant to me and everyone else, I'm sure. Okay. I told you about this. All right. So, jumping in, same format. Coastal Act policies that are relevant to the coastal hazards section. They're actually quite involved. There's 5 policy areas, and you'll possibly note that a number of these also affect other chapters of your document. So for example, you've already seen 30214 with respect to public access in the Coastal Access and Rec chapter. This is, we bring this up because we've talked about the interrelationships, consistency, and iteration at every meeting, and this is just another note about how we're trying to track it and pay attention to it. Now, the 1993 document broke the hazard discussion into really 4 major topic areas. It addressed erosion of coastal bluffs and upland slopes, seismic and geologic hazards, development, which really was about hazards to existing and or new development, and then a couple topics that were relevant to localized flooding and surface drainage, including agricultural irrigation was part of that discussion. From the California Coastal Commission, they have a lot of guidance about hazards, but the key piece that is new is that we need to acknowledge and address sea level rise in the LUP now. So you've noticed sea level rise policies they're actually in every chapter, but then they get more attention here because it's a hazard directly. So GPAC and community input on this topic, and I'm just touching on a few that were most of note to me. Folks wanted to see drought and the effects of climate change acknowledged as a hazard beyond sea level rise. They noted that drought and severe storms make all the other hazards worse. We also had input that we had probably done a fairly thorough job in looking at bluff erosion, but we did not look at enough at erosion throughout the planning area, and this is relevant not just to the bluffs, the coastal bluffs and the upland slopes, but all of the creeks and water courses and other drainages. So we've brought some new policy into that. This concept of risk of upset, that's actually, that's some CEQA language. We can if you're not liking that, we can redefine it if we want. But the idea here is that we have some sites that are at risk of being exposed because of hazards, and these are sites that have hazmat. So for example, the Half Moon Bay landfill is certainly exposed to coastal bluff erosion. It's already been breached, and it's been armored, and it's a concern that the county's been looking at. There remains an unmitigated landfill site over by the sand plant near Pilarcitos Creek. Because it's on the creek and the creek can erode, we acknowledge that also as a potential risk of upset. Half Moon Bay is pretty free of hazmat. There's a map of hazmat sites in the safety element that you had from last fall. Most of them are closed. On those maps, most of them are leaky underground storage tanks, and they tend to get remediated in a reasonable amount of time. There's probably a couple that are still open, but they're being monitored, and they will close. I'm pretty confident. So we didn't go beyond those two sites that I noted because these other ones are being, they're sort of in the San Mateo County Environmental Services has some oversight there, as well as some other agencies, the Department of Toxic Substance Control, and if groundwater is affected, the Regional Water Quality Control Board. This is not a city staff, we aren't the ones that go out and monitor these. We do need to know where they are if we're doing land use planning and we have an application with one of these sites. We certainly need to be aware of it, and it's considered in CEQA review. So that was GPAC and community input. GPAC in particular on that risk of upset. Now, I'm adding in also some input that we received from CAL FIRE because we do have a very high fire severity zone, a couple locations in the city limits, and that requires the city to address a number of state law components for safety elements, and I'll talk about that in a moment on the next slide about the approach to this document. But one of the things you'll see that was added here is a map that's very nicely prepared, actually, by CAL FIRE. A firefighter made that map for us and dropped it off at City Hall, and he couldn't have been more supportive of the city updating their coastal hazards. And I found it fascinating to look at where the fires had occurred, how big they were, and we listed the larger ones, but you can see more mapped. Now, understand that map will be updated into whatever GIS format we come up with, and will be more consistent with our maps as a whole. So the approach, this is a little bit different, and I've had positive feedback about this from Coastal Commission staff and CAL FIRE and some other places that I've been working with. The idea here is that this coastal hazards chapter would become a companion document with your safety element. So in the LUP, per the Coastal Act requirements, all of the hazards would be covered wholly in the LUP. The climate change, geological and seismic, flooding, fire, sea level rise. And so you have that. What you don't have, and I could have almost finished it, but I couldn't, is the other half, or the other bit, the safety element, the actual general plan safety element. What we intend to do with it is refer out to the LUP for the hazards discussion and simply say the hazards are described and the policies are provided in the coastal hazards chapter of the LUP. And now for the rest of the safety element, these are the things that are required by California state law for a safety element. We cover public safety and emergency preparedness, including disaster recovery, which is something that is required for even this fire code law that I was noting. And then those small-scale hazmat sites they don't really hit the Coastal Act as far as I was noting. So that way, we have a kind of a seamless document, and not kind of, it will be a seamless document with one solid set of policies, and so that the LUP chapter that you have will serve the purpose for your LCP, and the two documents put together will fulfill the necessary purpose of being a safety element. And what I like about it is we won't have redundant policies, and they're being prepared concurrently, and they will be consistent. So that's the approach. And with regards to discussion items that came to our minds, the sea level rise policies in this document are, of course, new for the city. And they were really generated by the sea level rise vulnerability assessment that came out in April 2016. A lot of these policies are in your 2016 draft LUP. We encourage GPAC input on them. There's an interesting one about, or several actually, about armoring, and if there's a site that's already armored, has coastal armoring, and there's no guarantee that you get to keep that, for example. So there's a whole range of these types of policies that I just want to bring your attention to. There's a policy that upon finishing the document and reading it again, I personally don't understand why we have it, so I just wanted to bring it up. It's number 56, and it's on page, where'd it go? Got it. Yeah, so it's on page 33, and it's relevant to tsunami and dam failure. So big catastrophic flooding events that are hopefully of very low probability, but you need to be prepared for them. So this policy suggests that we would allow development once these hazards no longer exist, and then there's a number of other conditions about it. And I just think the policy is unnecessary. And I think it could be misleading because it actually is dependent on subsequent studies. We would want those studies to have been completed, and that any infrastructure requirements are already in place. So it's, anyway, I invite you to take a look at that, not necessarily right now on the spot. We're going to talk about this at your second meeting again in September, and I just wanted to highlight this one. Another choice is how erosion is provided or covered in the document. You'll see that there's discussion of erosion in the geological hazards section, and then again in flooding. And the policies were, it was just a choice. They were provided in the flooding section. They could have just as easily been in the other section. In your 1993 LUP, it was a separate topic. I don't know if that appeals. We could parse it out if you wish. So I just wanted to note that because I know it's really important to folks. And then what's missing? There's such a relationship between habitat and hazards, and restoration in particular of perhaps wetlands or doing some kinds of watercourse restoration could be, it could go into coastal hazards. I had thought, I was putting it into natural resources. So where you want it is important, and if you feel it's a missing element here, then that's important to know. And then there's quite a few things that we could have considered beyond, and you'll note there's some of this in there, but vegetation, we have policies about fuel modification. This is basically fire breaks and clearances around structures, and the concern is when we need to provide access and we need to reduce fire risk, but at the same time we may have habitat and a habitat corridor, et cetera. So allowing for different approaches to fuel modification depending on the sensitivity of the area. We touch upon it. I don't know if it's strong enough. There are fire-prone vegetative materials in town, and we did not dig into that. The city has all kinds of landscaping requirements now because of state law. I can't remember the full name of it. We call it WELO, W-E-L-O, because that's the acronym. But it's very specific irrigation conservation measures, and it even has approved plant lists, and the plants have to qualify for being of a certain level of drought tolerance. There's turf limits in how many square feet you can have. But we don't look at fire-prone vegetation per se. So there could be sort of a package of how new landscaping is looked at. And that is, yep, that's the overview. This is a pretty meaty chapter, and we would expect some discussion and probably some contemplation before your next meeting, but we'd love to hear what you have to say so far.
Do you have any questions for staff on this topic? Seeing no questions, I'm going to open it up for public comment. Seeing no green cards or inquisitive looks from the audience, I'm going to close public comment and move to discussion with planning commissioners. Jimmy, questions?
So let me just start by saying once again, this is a great improvement over our existing approach to safety, which was really minted even before it was adopted. So thank you for the good work. I think I'm going to have a lot of detailed comments that I'm going to try to highlight. You know, I went through the document and marked it up, and what I want to do, out of respect for my fellow commissioners and the public, is just try to pick some high-level points, and you can infer that there are specific comments in the policies where that has ramifications that I would change. First, I think with respect to erosion and flooding and sedimentation, I would say our current policies seem to focus on flood as a bad thing, but erosion, sedimentation, and flooding are actually three sides of the same coin. That's what happens when your processes for transporting soils are out of balance. In some places, the soil moves faster from one place and deposits in another. That's erosion and sedimentation. The water might be moving too fast. That's flooding. And it's important for us to change our thinking. If we were going to find a framework for it, I would call it sediment transport balance. And I would identify these three topics as sort of the fundamentals of those. We have a lot of policies that focus on flood control. And since we recognized early in the process that stormwater should no longer be considered a nuisance, but in fact a resource, we should be talking about stormwater resource management. And of course that includes moving it from places that we don't want it to be to places where we do want it to be. But I think that the tone of our document needs to recognize that our objective is not simply to move the water away from one place, because that will get us to the wrong answer. I would also say that some of the policies we've inherited come from a time when this was like middle of the last century, when the way we approached moving stormwater was get it off your property and let it be somebody else's downstream from you. And you know, the Coastal Act was a big step away from that. And I think we need to, when we read our policies, we find pieces that still reflect that. And I can point to specific sections, but I won't bore you with them. I appreciated the fire regulations being brought up. I think the high-level concern I have in the draft fire regulations is that with respect to new development, the policies that we have with respect to modifications of fuel loads and things like that really apply when we have existing development. When we have new development, we shouldn't be, I think, allowing programs that make it possible to build something that's larger or more impactful if the policy permits them to remove vegetation in an environmentally sensitive habitat area. In some cases, that can increase the flow of floodwaters. It could actually aggravate one hazard to mitigate the fire risk. So the goal here is to recognize that with new development, our siting decision should reflect siting that minimizes that impact. And sometimes that just means building a little smaller.
Can I just
Yes.
ask for clarification on that point? Your point is that you have protection of ESHA and protection against a fire hazard.
Right, and
Competing interests.
well, they're only, if you could ask for a sufficiently large, an applicant could ask for a sufficiently large footprint that in order to maintain fire-safe protection, it would require the modification of fuel, which is a euphemism for removing vegetation. And that could be in a buffer or in an ESHA. And what I'm suggesting is that that should be something that the yard does, not something that the ESHA does.
Okay.
Or the buffer. There was there's a map, and I realize the maps are going to get updated, so this is not to suggest that it should be there, but there's a map that shows the flood zones, and I'm sorry I don't have the page number with me, but you'll see the blue lines that suggest the flood risks coursing down Pilarcitos Creek coming east to west, and another line that shows the water coursing through Arroyo Leon towards their confluence. And then, just as the map reaches sort of into the eastern edge of the city, the flood zone magically disappears. And this is one of the great features of Half Moon Bay. We can make flood risk disappear. And of course that's absurd. And I appreciate that we have in mind a policy to update our flood activity, but I think we're doing a disservice to the public to pretend that the flood risk stops at that location. There was a reference to warning systems within the document, and I think it's important to realize that with these different types of hazards, we have different kinds of populations that need warning. For example, a small tsunami might require people at or below, 30 feet to evacuate as a safety measure. A larger tsunami may require a larger group to evacuate. A dam inundation risk would have a different profile. A fire risk would have a different profile. And yet we have one tool for warning the public. We have one blasty siren, well, two big sirens, right? And I would like to see a policy that suggests a more nuanced approach to warning. Not because I think it's elegant or pretty or cool, but because I think it will save lives. If there's a hazard that requires people at lowest elevations or people on the Highway 92 corridor to get out of the way of harm, and the siren sounds like a tsunami, everybody gets on Highway 1 and it gets locked up. And any additional capacity we might create will do the same thing. The right answer is to be able to deliver the warning to the people who need it and not bother the people who don't. There was a reference to saltwater intrusion not being experienced in Half Moon Bay, and I just want to call out that in fact the Army Corps of Engineers study for, and by the way, I apologize if it's hard for you to understand my language. I just got a retainer and I'm learning how to talk, so bear with me while I struggle through this. But the Army Corps of Engineers did a study as one of its pilot studies for sea level rise in San Mateo County, and they did the Army Corps, they did the Sewer Authority Mid-Coastside Wastewater Treatment Plant. And in that study, they reported saltwater intrusion in the pipes down very low. So there is evidence of saltwater intrusion. I've also heard anecdotal reports of saltwater appearing in wells used for agriculture. So I think that sort of gives you a sense of some of the broad concerns I have about the areas where the document might be improved somewhat. I'll also point out that in the discussion of how we mitigate hazards, there are some policies that strike me as being throwbacks that are in need of being updated. For example, with respect to addressing hazards related to stormwater, there's a document that suggests if nothing else is feasible, channelize it. Channelization actually aggravates the flood risk, and it creates a host of other problems. So I'm going to have detailed comments for staff that describe those items and the need when we're looking at development projects to see not just the project site and the project, an area sort of nearby the project, but to understand the area where the project could have impacts, up and downstream, in and out of the dam inundation zone. It's a risk-oriented way of thinking about this. And in an era where we've experienced the Oroville Dam and the Fukushima as a result of the tsunami and this big Houston hurricane, I think we have to accept that we're living in a new era and the way we did it before just isn't going to work. So I'm hopeful that it's okay for us to call those out as real evidence of the change in the way things are working around in the world. Thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, Jimmy. Brian?
Sure, thank you. Just a couple comments, not necessarily on edits and changes, but just more global comments. I think I appreciate there's sort of an allusion in here to climate change education and the value of our coastal resources and sort of communicating the impacts of climate change. And I think we're a visitor-serving community and a tourist community. I think there's definitely a lot of value in trying to communicate the impacts of climate change. Certainly in some of our places where there's active erosion that's occurring, I think a lot of the folks who come over from over the hill would see a lot of value in some interpretive signage, environmental education type of sorts of things that can educate on what we're actually seeing related to sea level rise and erosion and that sort of thing. So that's not necessarily something that's specific to this chapter, but something that I think is worthy in sort of weaving through here and perhaps in other chapters as well. I appreciate the acknowledgement of green infrastructure. I would like to see sort of, I guess, a policy that emphasizes sort of nature-based solutions in terms of dealing with flooding and putting green infrastructure as kind of the first choice as we look at solving some of these things. Echoing some of Jimmy's comments in terms of using stormwater rather than thinking of it as something that we need to move away from one place to another, but finding out how we can actually use it to perhaps enhance habitat, slow water flow. I was at a conference not too long ago on green infrastructure and with the head of public works from San Francisco who had a great quote, who we all need to sort of embrace stormwater as our own personal savior. So it's something that I think we can really use to our advantage, and certainly living where I do in Arleta Park and seeing the erosion on the bluff tops and the sort of channelization that occurs down the Seymour Ditch and Myrtle and other areas. It seems like there's a lot of potential to sort of slow that runoff that could have a lot of real solid habitat benefits and other things. So I don't, we allude to it here. There's a section on green infrastructure, but if it's possible to sort of weave that in and sort of prioritize that the policies, I would be supportive of that. Beyond that, I think I appreciate the direction this is going, and yeah, thank you.
Great. John? Les? So I know so I wanted to echo the comments around channelization. Policies that encourage it should be removed or approached in such a way that we're focusing on how our overall stormwater resource management plan is implemented. And I'd echo the comments around having that stormwater resource management called out as a specific thing we need to be focused on. I know in the page 3 we're citing the Coastal Act directly with respect to public access, section 30212. One of the things that in my reading of this isn't specifically called out is not just in a generic way we call out coastal access along the coast, but the coastal trail itself as a resource that we need to protect isn't called out. And I'm not sure how to weave that into the language, but that's something that I think is an important aspect of what we do, and sort of ties into the longer term planning around this area. So that's my one piece of feedback is how do we address that that area. I'd like to circle back to the question you have about Isha in this section, Jill, and just try to ask for clarification. What are you looking for from us with respect to the Isha? What type of guidance do you feel like you need?
Well, there's a few things with that. So first off, you're reviewing this document absent one that I'm working on, natural resources. So it's going to help when you get that. But so really natural resources we're intending to include policies about habitat restoration, which could really be an implementation of green infrastructure and maybe be some of what you're not finding in coastal hazards. And I don't know if we should pick where you want it or if you'd like it to cross over a bit more. I'm Ms. Anti-redundancy, but I'm willing to be told otherwise. So there's that. And then another thing, the stormwater management, for example, that discussion, just so you know, natural resources is going to include hydrology and water quality. So the overlap with thinking about flooding it's really challenging. I even went through a phase of working on this where I thought about having a document called water. It's been hard to parse. So trying to rely on the Coastal Act and how the guidance document separates the categories as well as your existing local coastal program because folks are used to it. But if that's not working and you want to see this developed differently, we're really open to doing that. Maybe you want to see, I would recommend you see natural resources, which will come along, and then put these side by side and let us know what would be better.
So I'd recommend, unless I see other comments, that we have that Isha discussion when we get to natural resources and figure out if we need to make some kind of changes. And similarly, the address of stormwater management, if it fits better in the section you're drafting, then
Yep.
when we review that, we'll provide comment on it. With respect to armoring, what specific guidance do you want from us on armoring the bluff tops?
Well, I think the policy, well, first of all, it's all new. You don't have any policy quite like this. I hope, it was intended to be pretty strong and direct, and I'm looking for your comfort level with that. Of course, we're going to vet this a bit more. We have to make sure that we aren't setting up a taking. But this came from the engineer who prepared the sea level rise study, as well as planners reviewing the California Coastal Commission's sea level rise guidance document. So it's really born from that. We had very strong positive feedback from the Ocean Protection Council staff, who provided the grant that helped fund the sea level rise vulnerability assessment, as well as Coastal Commission staff. So they like this direction. We don't have final comments from them, but they were very pleased actually with the 2016 draft for that policy context area.
Jimmy?
So, two comments. First, before we get away from ESHA and hazards, it's not that I want to have a discussion about ESHAs. I just wanted to suggest there are some places where for example, the fire protection mitigation and benefits to habitat go hand in hand. For example, where we know that eucalyptus is a very hot burning plant, so is Cape ivy, whereas our native species are fire adapted. And I think there are places where we can make different kinds of comments in both without creating a which one do we go in. So some policies, maybe to avoid redundancy, you want to go to one or the other. But sometimes there are just different aspects that can appear in both. With respect to sea level rise and the policies with respect to armoring, they are bold. There will be people who like them, and there probably will be people who don't. And I read not too long ago that, I can't remember where, a reference to analysis at the state level that said if land becomes lost, if private property is lost to sea level rise, then it won't be a taking because it wasn't an act of the government. It was, I wouldn't say act of God. I'm not sure what the argument was, but it wouldn't be a government act. And therefore, if somebody lost their house, tough cookies. And I appreciate that the policies that you're proposed here are not quite that hard. However, I do think that we have policies that contemplate government action to protect our infrastructure. And where that happens, if energy, just to pose an example, when the Army Corps put the breakwater in for Pillar Point, it reflected energy that is widely perceived to have accelerated erosion in another area. And it's not hard to imagine a piece of infrastructure that armoring of a particular piece of infrastructure having potential adverse impacts in terms of the rates of erosion or other impacts on other properties. And that would be an act of government that had led to that. So I'm just suggesting that there are some nuances in the policies that if we want to avoid a takings problem, we want to think hard about. Yeah, those were my two comments.
Okay. My general feedback is the language I've read I'm comfortable with. I think we're going to get additional feedback from the Coastal Commission, but I think it's consistent with a lot of the feedback we've heard from the GPAC, and it's the direction people have asked for, and based on information we've received in other public meetings. So I don't have any concerns with the language as written. Okay. All right, so no other comments on this section. I'm going to close it, and we will move on to scenic and visual resources.
All right, let's jump into this one. Coastal Act framework. This one, there's a rather detailed Coastal Act policy. It's in your chapter now in whole 30251, specifically about scenic and visual qualities. But I wanted to note 30253, minimization of adverse impacts, has this statement that seems really relevant to Half Moon Bay. It's one of a number of sections of this policy, but it's the one that, I don't know, I think it really works here, about protecting special communities and neighborhoods that because of their unique characteristics are popular visitor destination points. I think your town has a lot of that, and it's something that bolstered redrafting this chapter was tapping into that a bit. The 1993 local coastal land use plan broke this discussion into 4 pieces. It had a focus on upland slopes. Another portion was roadside view, city pattern, and scenic highway, all put together. So a bit of the town form. Significant structures in historical areas, and this is really where historic resources got some time in the LUP, and then design guidelines for new development. The Coastal Commission guidance is a pretty thick section on this, but to really put it in a nutshell, work needs to be done when you update your LUP to identify what those scenic and visual resources are. Find them, describe them, and then determine if they are really in need of preservation and or restoration, or otherwise some other way of improving them. It also brought in night lighting, which is great because that was kind of your community's comment about town. And then I noted this landscape screening one because we've already used this policy direction in consideration of a project. This was the policy about not relying on landscaping as a means of evaluating visual impacts in a protected visual resource area. And I began to really like that policy a lot more, seeing its usefulness. So I want to highlight that here. GPAC and community input. It's kind of funny. The input on this didn't come straight to this part of the document. It's more about people being very protective and interested in the scenic nature of Esches, for example, but those comments ended up being more directed to biological resources section, but it could just as well have been here. Dark night skies was consistent as a visual resource. And then historic resources came up here as something that people really care about with regards to the scenic quality of the town. But from bluffs to hills, most of that was coming through in habitat and other sections. So that's okay. We were able to tease that out and created a bit of an approach to this. Would be very interested in your feedback. The idea here, kind of like what you had in the 93 document, looking at those 4 categories, took a different swipe at it. Categories are natural resources, coastal access, scenic landscapes, which I'll define in a minute, and the built environment. We're just trying this out. The intent is to not limit, but to organize, and it does a couple things for staff that you can think about while we go through this. And maybe it's helpful to you or the public, so we'd like that feedback. What I found in breaking them up this way was it was really easy to see where they cross-cut with other parts of the LUP. And then the other thing that happened is it became easy to see what we missed, and we missed a few things. So I'm sure we'll get some comments about that. So natural resources, things that you would expect. The ocean itself, your dark night skies. So we went from the ocean to the sky, and then everything in between of your bluffs, hillsides, ridge lines. We added vistas. That's not specifically in your current document. Sandy beaches and shoreline, riparian corridors should be areas, the Pillar Point landform, and I think we're going to hear probably about a few more things because there's so much here. Coastal access, the three that we honed in on, but there's certainly more to the coastal access network than these higher level categories, but specifically coastal access routes and points as they were identified in the coastal access and recreation chapter. The California Coastal Trail itself, which surprisingly is not identified as a resource in a lot of places, and we certainly believe that it is here. And then the town boulevard, we would, relate that to the development of this scenic corridor type of policy from before, moving it forward, including Highway 1 as well as the portion of 92 that's within the city limits, and that was per your direction. We would like to be so bold as to think the town boulevard would land in its finished form as a very valuable scenic and visual resource. Scenic landscapes. This is, if you ever think I make it up as I go along, I did right here. So this is very honest about that. These are not, these are developments, but they're not as you would think of development with building. A park is developed. Most of our trees, our significant tree stands, are planted. They were not native to the area. Our agricultural fields and operations, that's a land use. It's not a natural habitat. The harbor and marina, it's water, but it's got some controls around it. So the idea of scenic landscapes to me is actually pretty significant as somebody who comes into Half Moon Bay and, you notice this stuff. It's really important to the sense of openness, your ability to see the hillsides, your sense of where the bluff is going to come upon you. And so this was just another way of looking at it, and I'm not wed to it at all if you're not liking this concept. One of the challenges that I had in working on this document is there weren't a lot of definitions for what a protected resource is or a sensitive resource. And so that's something that you could think about if you wanted to provide some more specific definitions. Looked all through the Coastal Act and through your LUP and other places. And so there's just maybe an opportunity for that. Now the fourth one is built environment, very similar to your previous LUP, considering historic buildings and properties, the Main Street Bridge in particular, downtown as a whole, and then planned unit developments are, per the zoning code right now, they are protected visual resource areas. Policy direction. So one bit of input was, oh gosh, we really want this update to resolve conflicts that we have with how we deal with upland slopes. And what you may notice, I really didn't do anything for that. I want to talk about it and explain why. First of all, the challenge that we've had is actually in the zoning code. It's not necessarily in the policy. So knowing that, I want to just suggest one thing is that the zoning ordinance intends to address development on upland slopes and limiting development above certain elevation areas and having other criteria about that. It's pretty clear that folks are also interested in protecting views of the upland slopes, and the concern is about development on the flats and the kinds of, you could have one or two or however many policies you need to describe that, but coding for that is really different. And so I just want to note that when we get to the zoning ordinance, if you're interested in policies about that, it isn't about just tweaking the code that you have right now. There would be a need to produce some additional coding about that. And we have thoughts, but it's early for that. The other thing I keep noticing, I left it in, so when you go back through the document, you can peek at it. Use the PDF. You can search. It's a searchable PDF. The concept of clustering development. It comes up over and over in the 93 document, and it's been considered a really useful practice. One of the tools in your toolbox for dealing with a site that maybe has a significant portion. What if it's in a wetlands and you can cluster somewhere else? Or what if you have a view and you can protect the view? But sometimes clustering doesn't make a nice neighborhood, or it doesn't make a way to connect to the community around. It doesn't result in a handsome development form. So my suggestion would be keep it in there, but don't limit it. There can be multiple ways of approaching the most sensitive site design. So just thinking about that. This is going to come up later when we talk about PUDs in the land use context. It's brushed upon here. So just wanting to have you think about it while you're living your life in Half Moon Bay and noticing different properties. What's missing? We should have identified more of the USHAs in natural resources. There are a lot more coastal access areas than the coastal trail, the town boulevard concept, and the coastal access routes and points as provided in your coastal access and rec chapter. There are little pathways here and there, and if you want to extend some consideration of those, of course you can. A lot of them may be addressed in the scenic landscape section because parks are acknowledged, and some of them are in park areas, but some of them aren't, and it's kind of hard to pick it all up. There could be other scenic roads that interest you. And did we get all the vegetation in thinking about tree stands and the park areas and habitat areas? Did it all get covered? I'm not sure. We do have policy about a town forest. Lots of folks call this urban forestry. We're not necessarily wanting to call it that here. I think the town forest is got a little bit of traction with the GPAC, so that's why you see that. You saw a few photographs in this document, not very many. The previous version had many panels of photographs. They were sort of taken with the very unbiased eye of just going down a corridor and click, 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 this is what's there. And that's helpful. You know, it's the truth of what it is. But we actually heard a lot of feedback from people that they didn't like those pictures. They said, this doesn't look like Half Moon Bay. I don't recognize Half Moon Bay in this series, and it isn't helpful to me in thinking about how to evaluate the topic. So my in-house photographer took a few of these for me. We have about 100 more, and we just picked a few as examples because we think they sort of indicate why some of the policies, why some of what you're seeing is there. You could have this whole chapter have not a single photograph in it. That would be perfectly fine. For this draft, I thought it was useful to have a few, and your feedback is very much welcome. But that PUD is just one example, that first one there. We really think it's important to recognize what public infrastructure does to the experience of coming into Half Moon Bay. we all know that this is the most beautiful town ever, and yet you land with what is shown on page 9, and it's a little bit rough, and we know it can be better. And that's your town boulevard concept and a lot of other things. That that corner with the clusters of utility boxes and all those other things, that's just one. The other corner has a sign that is almost as big as I don't know what, like a shed. It's so large, and the pedestrian scale is tough. That's, you know it, you see it. And then the next page, in the very same area, we have Main Street looking like that, and of course the coastal trail. And we could go on and on with lots of different images. This is not unbiased representation of the city. This is really focusing and honing in on things that we're concerned about and things that we want to protect. So that was the approach. And that's it for this from us.
Thank you, Jill. Another very comprehensive document. You guys put a lot of thought into this. Do you have any questions for staff? Seeing no questions for staff, I'll open up for public comment on this section. If you have a green card, please fill it out. Otherwise, you're welcome to just make the comment and provide the... Do you have a comment? Okay, great. Seeing no public comments and people not making eye contact with me, I'm going to close public comment and we're going to move to discussion. Starting with the newest commissioner and working my way over. All right, I'll try that. John?
Oops. 4 kind of basic areas. This section really sparked my interest because there's just a lot of impact of subtleties, is the best way to say it. Some of my 4 generic categories are a little more complex than others, so I'm going to start with the simplest one. There's actually, I think we need to take a closer look at what we call downtown, because when I say downtown, it means Main Street. The reality is that's not downtown. Downtown is the center of commerce, and the center of commerce here is Safeway, Cafino, High School triangle. If downtown means that's where everybody goes for their daily business, then Main Street is not downtown. So, and I'm only bringing it up in the sense of this document, that there's a lot of references back and forth. And I think we probably need to somehow figure out old downtown, new downtown. I don't know what the wording is because, and it first came up on the section that's the Main Street Bridge. In page 16, we're reading through Main Street Bridge, and the very last sentence says it's prominence on Main Street at a primary gateway to the city. Well, that's probably the word city could say original city center, because that's what it's the entrance to. It's not the entrance to the whole city, and it's not necessarily a gateway. But that's what brought it to my mind, is that in the very next section down where it says downtown, so there's going to be these conflicting discussions all the way through this document. So I don't have an answer. I just, since it's a policy document, it seems like that's an opportunity to get a better definition of
Downtowns with a capital D. It
I
should
don't
be
know.
defined.
I don't know. Yeah,
I think it's fair.
Yeah. I struggled with the concept of view corridor. As I read through this document, it talks about views to be protected from public view corridors, not from private property. And that makes sense to me. I understand that. And what I interpret that as that's when you're looking down a street, you get a particular view. That's the view corridor, is when you look down a street. And I'm wondering if that needs a kind of a stronger definition, because in a little sketch that I drew, if you're looking down a street and you see limited by my vocabulary here. You're waving my arms, and I'm sorry. You're looking down, if you're in San Francisco and you're looking down the cable car Post Street, and then you see Alcatraz, that's a view corridor. If you turn sideways, all you see is buildings. So, and I think that probably needs, for me, a stronger clarity, that view corridors, are they in the directions of the streets? Because if you are driving down Highway 1 and you're looking down Highway 1, you get one view corridor. If you look down Poplar, you get another view corridor. If you look sideways at the private property, then you don't get any view at all. So then it starts to get in conflict. Do we want views of hills or not views of hills? And so it seems like if we're get a stronger definition of view corridor, that might help. So that one's kind of simple. So I have a question for staff and for our council. The word historic is kind of ambiguous and generic. And I'm anxious that, well, I'm excited that we have the idea that we have this old section of town that's been there for 150 years, and it's great. And it was a kind of a strip mall. You know, you kind of came in with your wagon and you stopped at the livery stable and went to the store and you stayed in the hotel and all that kind of stuff. And then it's evolved through time. Now we're kind of identifying it, and I think that there's probably lots of discussion and lots of times going forward where we're going to talk more about, are we talking about a vital area where lots of people want to be and hang out, and it's economically, that the marketplace drives the rents and has a mechanism to pay for improvements? Or is it we're going the direction of a town like Columbia where it's actually a museum in itself, and it's somehow recognized by government agency as that. So I don't know what direction we're going with that. My question to the staff is, does the word historic handcuff us going forward where there is avenues to kind of prevent any new ideas coming forward that might be better solutions to whatever it is we're trying to get to, because we're only in the policy stage. And so I'm curious if that word is kind of risky because it's so ambiguous, and it's a question. I don't know the answer to that.
I want to think about that a bit. We have a lot of input from the community about historic context, and so let's give us a chance, and we'll come back on the next session. The intent is to not limit future planning efforts, like a specific plan for having new development come into the context of a historic scaled and downtown with actual resources in it. Yeah.
And I've heard the staff talk about probably a stronger definition of historic. I'm familiar with, I've done buildings on the National Register, put them on there. So, it's not that I don't understand that, but right now our definition, New Leaf Market buildings are in the 50-year corridor and now are potential historic properties. So I appreciate that you're going to somehow work on the definition of that. And is it?
I think where this comes up is when you start doing psychoanalysis of projects and their impacts on what the city considers to be historic. And if a certain property or like a certain building or a certain visual corridor is listed somewhere in a city document as a historic resource, even if it doesn't qualify under state or federal standards, that's still considered a resource that could be impacted, and that CEQA requires minimization of the impacts or avoidance where possible, and mitigation measures to reduce the impacts. So I think at this level, the policy document is not itself listing the historic resources, but it's creating the policies that will then lead to the city deciding whether to list something as historic in the actual maps or list that it creates later on. So I think, this starts to think about when we do those lists, what kind of things do we want on there and not on there. I think at this level, you still have the flexibility to do that, but where the rubber hits the road is when projects start coming forward and they're going to have to minimize their impacts on what the city's decided to call historic.
lighting. Glad it's in here. I think there needs to be a number 15. Well, or 14B. So that's on page 19. So, and what I think needs to be added, and I'm just going to read what I wrote down in my notes, and I was out of town Friday morning through Monday night, so otherwise I would have given a chance to put this out there. My experience is that everything that's done at the planning permit level doesn't necessarily hit the finished projects, especially in terms of lighting. And I really agree that glare of the night sky and glare around the city is really important. And so my solution to that is, in the policy level, is to provide design review at construction phase of all projects, public, private, residential, and commercial, of exterior light fixtures facing public right-of-ways. So there you go. And it's at the construction implementation phase. And it's all projects, our city's projects, private, anything where lighting is going to face public review. Because talking about photometrics is at the design, planning permit level is impotent. Best word for that, yeah. So it is probably, now I have kind of in different pages, different specific questions and suggestions. Do you want other commissioners to first talk about general input? Because it's just, there's about a half a dozen or a little bit more of each section.
Do you, I think, from a big picture perspective, do you have any other big picture comments? And then the question is, are your comments ones that you'd be comfortable just sending in to staff as written comments, or are there things that you want to make sure that we are involved with?
I'll go quickly through them.
Okay, that's
On
fine.
the photographs, it's dramatically underestimated how difficult it is to do a photograph or a drawing that represents landscapes and feelings. And I would vote for no photographs rather than the kinds of photographs that are there. On the section that says Town Boulevard, page 14, I think the language that suggests that we're building something now that's going to be a protected resource in the future is kind of optimistic. And I don't think that needs to be in here to say that the Town Boulevard, whatever we build, is going to be a protected resource going forward, a sensitive scenic resource. On page 18, gateways, you talk about utilized landscaping and unified signage. I think that's way too specific for a policy statement. You have a section on visual compatibility, and this comes up all the time with the projects that we end up reviewing here at the Planning Commission level. There's the first sentence is great. I think the rest of it, being specific about what you can't do with things like cantilevers and blah, 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 is inappropriate. It's too specific. It's talking about specific construction types. I think we don't need to have that in there. I think we could alter that language where we're talking about visual compatibility to recognize that being compatible doesn't mean something has to look the same. The context is incompatibility. There can be something very old, something modified, and something really new and different, and all of that can be just great as a composition And there's maybe a better way we could word that, rather than talk about what you can't do. And there you go. Thank you for letting me do that. Yeah.
Les?
There are only two issues that kind of caught my eye. One was the town boulevard concept, and you know, unless we have something that's formally defined, you know, I have an issue anytime you refer to it because it implies something that is not known at this point. So I'm not sure how to word it in a way that gives you some flexibility in the future, but unless it's defined early on, I would kind of not make any reference to it other than maybe, again, I'm not sure what the concept should be, but the term town boulevard, kind of every time I see it, I gulp, so to speak. So, you know, that's an issue for me throughout this. The other one is the night lighting, and I'm focusing here. I was at I think several of our commissioners were at a meeting with on lighting at the high school, and you know, I just don't want to put anything in writing here that in effect says, okay, we have a high school, there's been a field there since 1949, now we can't have lighting there. So in terms of issues on that, so those were the two that, you know, from a policy standpoint, obviously the proof or the detail is going to be when we write code on this going forward. But I certainly want to make sure that we grandfather the baseball field, the high school, and other areas. I mean, I agree that if we don't want to have lights going all kinds of ways, but in effect saying, well, we now have a new policy, everything's going to be dark. That means no lighting at the baseball field, no lighting at the high school, or so on. So I think from a policy standpoint, they need to be fairly broad, and I guess we can then debate details when we all write code on this. So those are the two things that kind of are my craw at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you. First off, I guess I'd just like to say I do I do support the inclusion of photos. I think the photos are valuable in sort of being able to sort of see what the existing conditions are. I think particularly the photo of Highway 92 and the broad expanse of pavement there is, you know, it does show what that condition is, and I'm always a big fan of visual renderings and that type of thing. You could imagine what the sort of change would be there with some other sorts of things. So so I'll just put a vote there for the inclusion of photos, but just with the note that we should mix them up and have some foggy days and some sunny days as well. I'm wondering where public art fits into this in terms of visual resources, and so we don't necessarily mention public art, and particularly on so I guess page 7 and the table there for downtown, we don't list public art as a positive visual attribute. So so I would support inclusion of public art, certainly in the downtown core, but there are other areas too that I think public art should be, well, the existing public art should be supported, but then we should look at other policies that can sort of expand the expansion of public art in those spaces. And then in terms of signage, you know, there's some policies in here that are directed towards signage, but I think more focused towards commercial signage and not necessarily as much street signage, and Caltrans signage and that type of thing. So, you know, I don't know if this is the right place, or if there's support for a policy that would look at some level of a sign design guidelines, or if that would be included in the design standards, and specifically calling out, I guess, I mean, there is a section regarding right-of-way signage, referring to parking and directional signage, but there's a whole slew of other signage along the corridor in Highway 1, particularly between Kelly and Main Street. That's all sorts of other sorts of signage too. So I don't know what the right way to sort of get all those signs together and have some sort of a consistent theme there. I don't necessarily want to homogenize the signage everywhere through town and commercial buildings and streets, but having something that has some consistent themes and that sort of looks at with an eye towards aesthetics, I think would be nice, and just minimizing the number of signs, consolidating signs, having particular having them consolidated to the extent that they can, so we just don't have so many. Those are my major comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Jimmy?
So I'd like to dovetail on my colleagues. This is why I was hoping not to go first. I appreciate, as always, I learn a great deal from them, and I appreciate and agree with much of what has been said. With respect to the discussion of Town Boulevard, I appreciate that some will have trepidation. I heard that the last time, I still hear it. I would suggest that, if there's a linkage to, if there's a reference to see another section that describes that, then it might provide some additional clarity. And of course, if that idea blows up, then the references to it will blow up nicely at the same time. So you get and if it succeeds, then you have a clear reference. So perhaps that is a way to alleviate some of the concern about the references to Town Boulevard as a pig in a poke in this document. With respect to dark skies and grandfathering, I'm pretty sure that that no one would advocate applying retroactively to take away the lights at the high school. I would say, in speaking for some of the neighbors in that area, that I think that a case could be made that when the hours get extended very long, that it could have adverse impacts. So the quality of the light isn't just its presence or absence, but its intensity, its duration. And it may be that there are policies with respect to dark skies that can address those that would not necessarily rise to the level of trying to take away the high school football games at night. I guess I'd put it that way. And I do think that there are some uses in the city of existing stuff that it would be nice to encourage a reduction of some of that light impacts. I'm thinking of the glare that comes off of our horticultural institutions. If you come by on a foggy night, it just looks like there's a, alien sight, just in the fog a little bit. So I'm hopeful that we can find language that would allow us to encourage changes that reduce impacts, but that doesn't sound so draconian as to end the joy of night football games. With respect to the discussion of, I appreciated that you caught riparian corridors in your document. I think visual resizes include wetlands and, as you say, a broad set of issues. There are areas such as the Roosevelt Watercourse, the Pullman Watercourse, the Seymour Watercourse, and others that may or may not be identified as in the current document. I'd like to see them included. The list of trees that you mentioned, the need to extend it, I think was worthwhile. There are tree stands like the one in Sweetwater that probably don't fit into any of the neat categories that we have in place right now. And I think and yet it's a fabulous resource. People walk through it and are thrilled by it. So I hope that we can expand that. I also think it's important to realize that where we have forests, it's not just the large tree structures that are valued vegetation, the understory underneath the canopy. is also an important resource. If it's a riparian area, there's probably in-stream vegetation, emergent vegetation that's relevant. So I'm looking for an inclusive definition here that incorporates those. In the list of positives and negatives, in several of the different types of visual resources where we talked about the things that we like and that are really pleasant about it and the things that aren't. I don't know about you, but one thing I'm going to miss when they underground the power lines on Highway 1 is all those hawks that sit on those power lines. I don't know if you watch those, but wildlife is really important in areas that you wouldn't necessarily think. It provides a lot of value. On the negative side, the recreational vehicle campground at the north end of town in the beach, it's a valuable coastal resource. I appreciate that it provides coastal access. From a visual resource point of view, I guess the best thing I can say is the park itself is featureless. I don't know if we could do something about that, but it sure would be nice if we could. The references to the different types of natural resources could be fleshed out. Dunes were missing. There was that list of, the ocean, the bluffs. Dunes seemed like one that was important to pick off. Recreational areas, I noticed that the horse trail was not on the list, and I think it has a quality that is worth recognizing. On the negative side, in the vicinity of Poplar, of course, there is the landfill, the emerging landfill, which is not such, it would be on the negative side, I think, there. In the discussion of downtown forests, or town forests, I'm sorry, I appreciate that we had a policy for, there's a proposal to have a policy to basically install some, what was the language? I think it was for replacement of the existing trees. I'd like to see policy that is a bit more expansive about the quality of our downtown forest. So right now we have these little 4x4 tree boxes that professional urban foresters call tree coffins. All of our trees were planted at roughly the same time, so they'll all roughly die at the same time. There's not that much diversity. It would be nice to have a richer ecosystem of our downtown forests. With respect to the public scenic view corridors, I wanted to agree and perhaps slightly disagree with what John had mentioned, because I agree that looking down the end of the streets, you do get view corridors. There are many streets where the views extend laterally off the street. So if you're, and it's not just Highway 1 and 92, if you're, for example, on the frontage road going south beyond the Lutheran Church, you get that nice view into the ag fields going towards the ocean. So I do think it makes sense to get a better specification, but I want to be sure it's not just limited to the endpoints. And with respect to scenic corridors, I don't know if we can include the sand plant driveway, but I think it's worth considering. It's not a public road; it's a driveway, but the institution that owns it is a public institution. So I don't know. I defer to staff on how that plays out. But Naples has a beautiful view. Lewis Foster Drive has a beautiful view. I can think of some other roads that probably belong on that list, and I'll provide that. I see the clustering conversation in both directions. When I think of a place where clustering doesn't, where not clustering achieved a great result, I think of Asilomar. This is a place, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there are small buildings located in different places, and because they're widely distributed, the impact on viewing the landform is minimal. And so you get a focus on the landform rather than on the structure that was created there. On the other hand, if we're in a sensitive view corridor like, I'm thinking of the Venice PUD, but I'll just be illustrative rather than speak specifically. I could envision development that would minimize the provision of roads, impacts to natural resources, conflicts with coastal access, regional recreation coastal access, that would be consistent with clustering. So I think allowing having our policies allow a balance between applying clustering where it makes sense and seeking to reduce it where it has adverse impacts on the landforms appealed to me. I appreciated staff's proposal for distinguishing between development that limits, policies that limit development on the hilltops and policies that limit development that impacts views of the ridge lines. And I think if we need both, I think we should have both. I'm not sure we have land in the city that is high enough to impact the ridge line without being a really tall building. But there are certainly view corridors where development could impact the view of the ridge line. And I think it makes sense to be explicit about that, and I support it, because I think that those ridgeline views are valuable resources. With respect to the list of natural environmental resources, I know the list was notional in some ways, but I noticed that coastal prairie, coastal scrub, I can think of ecosystems that are not in the list, and I would say take an eye to the list of different natural habitats. If you're going to include some of them, include all of them, or make it clear that the ones you're including are just illustrative. Then with respect to specific policies, I would just speak to a couple of them. Policy 1 made a reference to the views from the coastal terrace to the foothills, and I think that was intended to be a sort of a generative of description. It was supposed to be broad and say there are so many things from this end of town to that end of town and everything in between. It could be, the policy could be read as saying all we're protecting is the view of the terrace and the view of the hilltops. And I want to be sure that, I know that's not what staff meant. I want to be sure that that is clear in the policy. The list of places from which we protect views in policy 4 did not include vertical trails, and I think it should. Policy 6 should include the ridge lines. Policy 8 we should avoid planting vegetation that impacts views. We recently heard a coastal development permit that involved someone who had planted vegetation in an area, even vegetation that was native, that had grown to impact the view looking out westward. And I think that we should be having policies that exclude that from happening. On the other side, policy number 25 that treats landscaping, I think that if we attach a condition to a coastal development permit that says we are screening, we did that to improve the visual resources of the city. And I think that vegetation that has been imposed as a condition of a permit should be considered a visual resource to be protected, maintained, replaced if it dies, etc. I've already talked about dark skies in policy 12. I just want to again say thank you for including it, and I would hope that it can address greenhouse glare. Policy 22, the fire district line, again, this is with respect to fuel modification, and the goal here is that we should be citing and designing our project to make fuel modification unnecessary. Obviously, if that would result in takings, we have to make concessions, but that's the goal. There was a policy on lot line adjustments and land divisions. That's policy 32, and I think it's the goal of the policy, but I just want to call it out more sharply that a subdivision or a lot line adjustment should not create a lot where development on that lot would require damage to the view resource. I mean, if somebody's got a big parcel and they're creating a subdivision, I get that there's an impact because you don't have an open space anymore where you once did. So I'm not saying this is an absolute, but if someone designs a subdivision so that one of the lots is sitting right next to a view resource and there's no other place to put it, that should not be okay. There should be a way to say, no, you build your, you don't put a lot line in a place where the parcel you're left with would result in takings if we forbade development for visual resource impacts. I hope that makes sense. And I'll provide more detailed comments. Believe it or not, I have them in writing. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thank you for being the penultimate comment provider. I'll try to keep my comments brief. I share a lot of the same comments with my colleagues. I do believe that it's always a challenge to get good photographic evidence that captures the nature of what we're doing. I do think it's an effort worth pursuing. So I do disagree a little bit with John on that one. It's a bit of a challenge, and I'm sure the owner of the car wash on the corner of 92 and Main Street has heard a lot of public feedback about the quality of that structure. I won't belabor the point. With respect to the lighting, in terms of having it point down, I think we were on page 19 or so. I think if we have existing permitted uses like the high school, I think you could call out existing permitted uses. We have some existing unpermitted uses that we should not grandfather in. So I think that might be the language to approach. I do agree with John's point about not getting overly prescriptive with some of the language that we had in there. I think it's worth calling out that we have residential design guidelines rather than specifying like some of the detail. We're getting overly prescriptive here. And to the extent that in the future we have commercial design guidelines, when that document is completed, it would be great to call that into, as opposed to being overly prescriptive here. I am a little concerned about the boardwalk or the town boulevard concept. I think that that you've got a question on that one. Okay, we can bring it up. I just, it's something where we can say, hey, this is something we're going to do, and we'll incorporate it in the future, because we can make modifications to the LCP, the LUP in the future. So I agree with that. I am concerned in a material way about the removal of the upland slopes. I do think it's something where, my recollection in reading the Coastal Act is that the upland slopes are actually protected specifically, and I'd like to make sure that we cite that part of the Coastal Act in what we do here. And I do think that in the zoning we've called out specific height requirements, but I do think protecting the upland slopes should be called out in here. To the extent that we have unpermitted vegetative screening, especially along scenic corridors, I think we should have a policy that allows us to say, hey, look, yeah, your house has been here for 30 years and you've allowed all this vegetation to grow up, you're blocking a view of the ocean. So maybe having a policy where somebody has to apply for a retroactive CDP when they're blocking scenic corridors. I think that might be worth taking a look at or considering. I know and maybe I missed it, I know we call out how the utility poles are not an attractive thing, but I'd like to see a policy where we specifically say, all new development should have underground utilities. And we have that? Yeah, okay, so I might have missed that. And then as we do new development, to move to undergrounding existing utilities. I think that's, I'd like to see it as, okay, it's there. Okay, great. So, okay, great. Sorry, as I said, I think I might have missed that one. You kind of get delusional after reading through a lot of this for a while. I do think it's, this whole question of what's a coastal view. I remember sitting in several GPAC meetings where we had some lively discussions about what's a coastal view. Is it down the street, or is it at a 45-degree angle to the street when you're looking across a clear field to the ocean? I think there are, and how is it 100 feet from the intersection? We need to get into some definition around what is a coastal view, because we're probably gonna have some sticky issues in the future around coastal views and what's protected and what's not. It'd be good to get this part clarified, and to, I think, Brian's point earlier, there are some streets that aren't called out as having coastal views that clearly have, you know, clear coastal views. They have beach access points, and so I think this is an area where we should probably spend a little more time, and if necessary, come back and get into a little more detail. But I want to make sure that we've hammered out the coastal views, because that's, again, it's an area of concern that at least that I have, having seen a lot of lively discussion around it. Yeah, I do think I would share the feedback of adding scenic trails would be helpful in, you know, somewhere between policies 4 and 7. Yeah, and I think, you know, the other areas that have been raised, except for I've marked my disagreement, I think I'm largely in agreement with everybody else's comments. Any other comments from staff? I mean, from the planning commission?
I just wanted to, after, that one got a lot of comments, and I just want to say, notwithstanding the suggestions, this is a vast improvement over our existing chapter in visual resources, and I am very grateful for this took an incredible amount of work, and this is clearly a labor of love, and my hat's off to you.
So, I do.
I want to just echo that sentiment. John, you had some other comments?
Going back to when I very first started talking about the difference between identifying what exists and then the policies, what I'm struggling with a little bit is we've got a lot of good information about the built environment in the what exists, you know, the resources part, but in the built environment policies, I don't see anything that's addressing historic buildings, Main Street Bridge, downtown, that chunk. We don't have anything in the policies to talk about. And maybe that's the right way to be. I don't know. So that was my confusion about that. And I really like number 31 on page 21. Thank you. It's the design, the idea of a design review process somehow, yeah, as a policy. Yeah.
Did you want to respond to that, Jill?
I have a couple things that I just want to run by you, because it occurs to me that the way the Town Boulevard piece was posed was backwards. I think maybe it should have focused on what already is known in the 93 document, and frankly the Coastal Act supports, is the scenic corridor of Highway 1. We already recognize that it is that, and that instead of acknowledging the Town Boulevard to be a protected resource, it's actually implementation of anything like the Town Boulevard needs to be mindful of the scenic corridor, views from it, views of it, etc. So can I give that a try and flip it around? Okay, good. I think perhaps just a little quick one on the historic items. I think I was assuming we covered it a bit in cultural resources, but that needs to crosswalk a little bit stronger, so I really appreciate your feedback on that. I'm wondering if you need another meeting on this or not. I made assumptions about that, but
I'm not sure we need another meeting. I mean
right now, yeah.
I think maybe we can have this as a discussion point. My one concern is at some point I'd like to have an opportunity for us to address the scenic corridors question, because again, I suspect that's going to be a real sticky issue in the future.
you know, I think I have some minor comments, but I don't think they rise to the level of needing another conversation. So I'm happy to submit those and see what comes out so we can move on to the next sections. I think we do need one for the hazards, however. I don't think we're there on hazards yet.
Yeah, I think there's a natural resources section that we're going to cover, so.
There are a couple other thoughts in this presentation to conclude, and then I'd like to talk about next steps very, very briefly. I think you've noticed, again, this iteration, this connection, for example, the coastal trail, it comes up in hazards, access, scenic resources. The town boulevard comes up, of course, in access, scenic resources. It will come up in land use. Historic downtown idea is in recreation as a visitor serving attraction, also in cultural resources and scenic resources. So over and over again, we know they're coming up, and we're preparing these one by one, and so we'll go back and take your comments and try to converge better on the language. And the definitions that you're asking for are absolutely necessary. So every time they pop up, please just keep telling us. It's really, really helpful. You did all of this, so we thought we would have a continuation of this on September 26th, but I frankly think we have enough input that we could work on revisions and getting some support from policy folks who are helping us out, as well as city attorney and coastal commission staff possibly, and working on these definitions before bringing these back. So I would actually be happy to pack them up and take them away for a little while if that's okay with you.
I don't think there's any concern about that.
Okay, your feedback was really thorough and appreciated, and I do want to suggest maybe if you need, and because I know the scenic and visual resources just landed on your porches on Thursday. If you need more time with that and have more feedback on it, that's fine. You can give me a call and we'll go through it. But it seemed like a really thorough feedback. So what we told council is the next piece that we can bring forward is a portion of land use. I feel comfortable working on the core area because we had so much GPAC discussion about that, and we just had a council review of the core area boundary again. They actually suggested expansion of it would be fine, and we'll run that by you. It's for your confirmation. But I think I need to go back and look at where I am with that. But I think we should keep moving. We can't bring natural resources to you with the new map yet. That's another option. I could bring it without that great information, but I feel that would miss the wisdom of the Huffman Broadway work that is beginning. So I don't know. I was playing with that, but I'm not comfortable with it. We're not ready to bring PUDs, that part of land use, or urban reserve, open space reserve, and ag. So that would be sort of a bifurcation of land use. So that's the idea. I need to go and see if I could maybe have something for you for September 26th. Yes.
I was just going to mention, I believe Commissioner Damon and myself are both going to be absent on September 26th.
Okay. We should go through when people are going to be around for the next two meetings, because we have a few questions about that. So anyway, that's what I'll look at, and I will send you an email.
Yeah, we'll move that to the Planning Commission.
Yep,
That's
I'll send you an email on that, and that was it.
I want to just hit one point before we completely close out, which is, I think John's raised a very important point, is we have this historic downtown, we have this downtown core area. I'm concerned about creating an overly technical definition around the historic downtown, because the people who live here call downtown downtown, and then there's this other thing that doesn't have a name. And so this other thing that doesn't have a name, maybe it's the whatever, we'll figure that out. We have a downtown. I think a lot of the documentation refers to what the downtown is. It might be good to create the definition around that, as well as the definition of the downtown core area, which is different. So just from a planning perspective, I don't want to have this historic downtown, which is something, just because the town doesn't use that language. And so it makes a document more
Right.
technical than it needs to be.
So the core area kind of includes all of that, and the original town is really, it's just set apart from the rest of the town by the creek. So maybe there's some way to be starting to look at it that way, that our planning area is the whole downtown, and then there's another section of it that's the original set apart.
Right.
There's probably some way to do this.
Yeah, I'm just always, making documents more impenetrable is
Yep.
something I want to try to
Yep.
avoid.
Yep.
So, referring back to your draft bylaws, we'll have something coming up in a meeting or two. But we got to take harassment training this week, which means you get to take it too. And so I have been asked by the city clerk if you would prefer to have a trainer come in for a 2-hour session, or if you'd like to do it online, which please do that one.
I would like to recommend that we do this online.
Thank you.
I second that.
All right.
I've just completed my online training for my company, so I'm happy.
Maybe we can use that. Yep,
I will print out my certificate.
yes. Let us check it out. Okay. Every 2 years? I think it's every 2 years. Yeah.
We're going to go dig up all of our
Some of us get it.
online certs. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
some people get a 1 year or a 1 hour, and you get a 2 hour. We had a 2 hour. So.
Lovely.
All right, emergency coastal development permits. We're working on one for a phase 1 short-term, kind of hold it in place for Seymour Ditch. And so we'll tell you more about it at your next meeting. It has not yet been issued. Coastal Commission staff is aware of it, and they're supportive. The Ritz Piers has not concluded, so I can't give you any more on that right now either. Wanted to mention, Chair Hernandez asked me to, well, you kindly reminded me that we were supposed to give an update on Pacific Ridge. And I don't have a lot, but I think I have the high points of perhaps what you're interested in. So there's 3 phases of the map. Phase 1 has been approved for final map, and that's what you see where individual lots are now having houses built on them. And phase 1 was sold to Edenbridge, the builder who is out there. Phases 2 and 3 are in for final map review. When they're ready to go, they will go to the city council, and along with them will be some additional actions for city council to take. One of those actions is related to the funds for lot retirement. There's a letter of credit. The funds are secured, but we do not have them yet. And we can't get them until the final map is approved. There's a very specific sequencing to how this has to be done. So as soon as the final map is approved, then council can take the action to bring those funds in. The first amount, and I brought the wrong one of these, is on the order of $1.3 million, and then subsequently, I think within a year of that, the rest of that would come, which is about the same amount. So it's at that point that, per the settlement agreement, per the terms of that agreement, that City Council will be asked to provide direction and strategy for how the funds should be used for purchasing lots and retiring their development rights. So that's where that is, and we'll have a lot more detail for you when that is prepared for council.
So I just want, thank you for
Yep.
the update. Phase 1 has been sold off as a separate development from the Phase 2 and Phase 3, so it has different ownership now.
Yes, it does.
So my concern with the project is that, and I'd ask staff to consider withholding occupancy permits until we have clear definition of Phase 2 and Phase 3, because the whole project was permitted as one whole. And so we just want to make sure that this is defined before people start moving into their homes. I mean, there are other ways, we'll look to our council to deal with this, or address this, but the concern is that we've broken up a project that was one whole project, and now we're trying to address something as a separate piece of it with separate ownership. So it's an area of concern.
So just briefly, because it's not on the agenda and I don't want to dig into too much, our assistant city attorney is not able to work on this with us because they had another role on this project. So we're working with Reed, who you know from ABC, who has background on it, and I will check in on that. But I can tell you, Phase 2 and 3 are going to go to council before final C of Os are going to be ready to go on any of those homes. I think the sequence of that should work out, but I will check on it and we will get back to you.
Thank you.
Okay. So then the only other thing I have is talking about your next meetings, and I think we need to spend a couple minutes on this. For September 12th, we noticed in the paper for a project on Parissima. It's a small addition to a converted single-family home that's used as a business. And it occurred to us that I think 2 of you were traveling, and then we realized that 1 of you may have a conflict of interest. So we all of a sudden had a very thin presence in the room for looking at that item. So that's the first thing. And then let's talk about that September 26th availability as well. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to confirm I'm traveling the week of September 12th. I think you're also in Florida.
I'll be in Florida for the September 12 meeting. Glad to participate electronically. Although I inferred from her comments that she hoped for a larger group, I don't know whether that, how dominant that should be in our thinking. I mean, a quorum is a quorum, and we can decide with a quorum.
Yeah, I think that maybe let me move to another point, which is on the 26th. Do we have, right now, I'm planning on being present for the 26th. Who else is there?
I'll be here.
Do we have any conflicts between Evans? Okay. Brian.
I am out, yeah. I mean,
For that
I
item.
can make myself available electronically if needed, digitally.
It's a property right across the street from your office. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Through the chair.
Okay.
I wouldn't, you know, I sit at the feet of other people sitting here on the table with respect to the Fair Political Practices Act. But as I recall, if there is a necessity for a quorum, even if we have a conflict, we can manage to have a meeting by drawing lots. Although if we continue the item, maybe we can get out of it. Is that the thinking of staff?
Sorry, it sounds like maybe we need to look into the potential conflict a little more and then think about when and how to consider the item. So I'll look into that before the 12th.
Given the time zone differences and some of the work commitment from this trip in China, want to make sure that there's a strong possibility that I may not be able to participate and may have some challenges noticing the location. So I think you're going to have to assume that we'll have, you know, Jimmy can be present for that meeting, and if not, maybe it makes sense to punt to a future time frame. I know it inconveniences the applicant, but it's another consideration is maybe we move it back a month so that we have proper, but we'll look for staff to come back to us with a recommendation. Okay. Any other items you want to cover? Great, thank you. Close that portion of our meeting, and do we have any planning commission communications? Seeing none, I'm going to close that and ask for a motion.
I'll move to close.
Have a second? Aye. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.